Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Ryan from Gibson's Bookstore. We have a very special event for you tonight in partnership with the Showing Up for Racial Justice organization. We're very pleased to present tonight's authors, Jon Wiener and Jody Armour, in conversation as they discuss the Chicago 7 trial in light of the political protests of the past year. The authors' books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. We offer shipping, in-store browsing, and curbside pickup as well. I will put links in the chat throughout the event, so keep an eye out for that. And without further ado, Sarah, Carissa, Jon, Jody, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and please take it away.
Ryan, thank you so much. Thank you, Gibson's Bookstore, for being such an excellent partner in this. And thank you to both of our authors for being present this evening and giving us of their time. It's such a pleasure to meet you in real life. I'm just going to give everybody a background on both of you. So Jody David Armour is the Roy P. Cocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California. A widely published scholar and popular lecturer, he studies the intersections of race, law, morality, psychology, politics, ordinary language philosophy, and the performing arts. His latest book, N-Word Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law, looks at America's criminal justice system, among the deadliest and the most racist in the world, through deeply interdisciplinary lenses. Armour is a Soros Justice Senior Fellow of the Open Society Institute's Center on Crime, Communities, and Culture, and he is on the board of directors for LEAP, which stands for Law Enforcement Action Partnership, an international 501c3 nonprofit of police, prosecutors, judges, corrections officials, and other law enforcement officials advocating for criminal justice reform. He has published articles in Stanford Law Review, California Law Review, University of Pennsylvania Journal of Constitutional Law, American Journal of Criminal Law, Vanderbilt Law Review, Boston College Law Review, Southern California Review of Law and Women's Studies, University of Colorado Law Review, University of Pittsburgh Law Review, Loyola of Los Angeles Law Review, Southwestern University Law Review, and Ohio State Journal of Criminal Law. His award-winning book, Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Costs of Being Black in America, from New York University Press, addresses three core concerns of the Black Lives Matter movement, namely racial profiling, police brutality, and mass incarceration. Armour also appears as a legal analyst on NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, PBS, MSNBC, NPR, and many other television, radio, and internet news programs. At the request of the U.S. Department of State and European embassies, Professor Armour has toured major universities in Europe to speak about social justice, as well as hip-hop culture and the law. His work on the intersection of law, language, moral luck, and the performing arts grew into a unique interdisciplinary and multimedia analysis of racial justice titled Race, Rap, and Redemption, and featuring performances by Ice Cube, Maida Deval, Saul Williams, Lulu Washington Dance Theater, Macy Gray Music Academy Orchestra, Mylon Rivera. Armour currently teaches criminal law, accident law, and a seminar on stereotypes, prejudice, and the rule of law. Professor Armour, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so Jon Wiener started out in the 60s writing for the Old Mole, an underground weekly in Cambridge, Mass. He sued the FBI for their files on John Lennon, dating from the time when Nixon had ordered Lennon deported from the US to silence him as a critic of the Vietnam War. After 17 years of litigation, including a Supreme Court appeal, Wiener v. FBI, court denied, the government settled and released almost all of the pages that had been withheld on the grounds that they contained national security information. That story is told in his book, Gimme Some Truth, The John Lennon FBI Files. He's taught American history at UC Irvine, specifically the course Politics from FBR to Obama, and is a longtime contributing editor at The Nation, where he hosts the magazine's weekly podcast, Start Making Sense. His guests there have included Naomi Klein, Gail Collins, Chris Hayes, Paul Krugman, Rebecca Solnit, and Barbara Enright. His recent books include How We Forgot the Cold War, a historical journey across America. The New York Times Book Review called it a political argument masquerading as a travel yarn. Convincing. He's also the author of Conspiracy in the Streets, The Extraordinary Trial of the Chicago 8, which includes illustrations by Jules Pfeiffer and a cover story by Richard Avedon. He lives in Los Angeles with his wife, the video artist and photographer, Judy Fiskin. Professor Wiener, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
What incredible backgrounds you have. I am so looking forward to this conversation. And with that, I'll pass it over to my co-conspirator, Carissa Caro, to start our conversation.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to start with a little bit of background and context about New Hampshire education experience. And a lot of the work we do in SURJ is education because we need to understand our socialization and our history before we can show up, right, in ways that are meaningful. And we recognize that and know that. I'm going to speak for myself and my experience working in schools in New Hampshire as a teacher and a consultant. And we think of our US history courses, and it really ends at the middle of the 20th century. And the second half of the 20th century doesn't really get the justice it deserves. And I wonder if we can start with a conversation or a probing question, what is lost by not studying trials such as the Chicago 7 trial or the protest movements of the 60s in depth? And what should we know about those things in order for us to really do better now?
Well, first of all, we want to say thank you to SURJ in Concord, and thank you to Gibson's Bookstore, and thank you, Sarah and Carissa. We're delighted to be here, and it's only because of Zoom that the two of us in Los Angeles can be in Concord tonight. It's a pleasure, and I've taught the history of the 20th century United States, so I've had students who didn't know too much about the history you're talking about. There's an old saying that the people who don't understand the past are doomed to repeat it. I'm not sure that's actually true, but we feel that the past, there are episodes of the past that really help us think about the present, not just because we might repeat it, but because we can do better. The 60s were a peak moment of social movements, of protest, first around the civil rights movement, the discovery of mass direct action, and then that all got transformed when the Vietnam War peaked in the late 60s, and we had more thousands, and then up to 1 million people in the streets. People think it's a little bit like what we've had in the last summer, but I think what we've had in the last summer with Black Lives Matter was a whole lot better than what we had in the 60s. And I was there in the 60s. You can see I'm an old white man, so I know what I'm talking about here. And I'm always delighted to see Jody, who's one of our most brilliant strategists and smartest activists, and one of the most enjoyable people to talk to about this stuff.
John, I leap to agree with you. I couldn't agree more that we really have much to learn today and apply today from the lessons of yesterday. The one that came to mind as I was thinking about this conversation with you, which I always, love and learn so much from, you as a scribe, as a historian. But what I was thinking as we were starting, as I was getting ready for this, is how much change are we really going to see if we have the same approach taken to Black Lives Matter as was taken to the Chicago 8 or Chicago 7, right? A lot of things that they were saying about the folks, the Chicago 7 or 8, whichever way you want to characterize them. I don't want to leave out anyone important in the discussion. Right. Everyone's important. But a lot of those same criticisms were applied to people like me. I've been characterized as a Black identity extremist who conspires with people who are Black Lives Matter, namely, who are bent on riotous behavior, right? So you could, from a certain perspective, if we're not careful, we can repeat some of the errors of the past by forgetting that, sometimes people we want to go after because we think that they are doing harmful things to the public discourse, like Trump on Twitter, right? We wanted to get him off Twitter. Many of us wanted to get him off, and we celebrated his getting off Twitter, many of us. But I wasn't celebrating so much, because I was thinking about, it's Trump today, but I don't want some oligarchs in Silicon Valley saying that Armour and Black Lives Matter and Melina Abdullah and Patrisse Cullors are Black identity extremists, and they're saying things that are inciting riotous behavior, and we just need to deplatform them. And oh, by the way, if they try to go to something like Parler and create something outside of the conventional platform, we'll shut that down too. We'll shut it all down if they're saying things that we find abrasive. And that I immediately start thinking about the Chicago 7-8 trial when I hear that. So I think we got so much to learn from, the stuff that you wrote about that trial. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it, John, today and making the connection.
Well, let's just remind ourselves a little bit about what the story of Chicago in 68 and 69 was about. 1968 was a presidential election. It was at the peak of the Vietnam War. The Democrats were in power. Lyndon Johnson was the president. He had escalated the war in Vietnam. So the anti-war protests of that year were all aimed at the Democratic Party. And the Democrats had their convention in Chicago that year, and a variety of radical groups wanted to protest at the convention. And originally they wanted to bring hundreds of thousands of people to Chicago. There'd already been demonstrations in Washington of hundreds of thousands of people, but Mayor Daley, Richard J. Daley, the memorable right-wing Democratic mayor of Chicago, said that he ordered the police to shoot to kill arsonists and shoot to maim people who were destroying property. And that scared a lot of people. And so instead of hundreds of thousands of coming to Chicago to protest, really only 10 or 15,000 people came. So in a lot of ways, the demonstration was kind of a failure. Not enough people showed up. But the police did attack the demonstrators. It was on worldwide TV and almost live. The whole world was watching, is what we said at the time. And so the news media made it an international protest event. LBJ had withdrawn from his own re-election campaign because there was so much opposition within the Democratic Party to the war. The Democrats instead ran his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, and Nixon narrowly won election in November of 1968. Then Nixon became president. One of the first things he did after he took the oath of office, which is, we all know the date now, January 20th is when the president takes the oath of office. One of the first things Nixon did was invoke a new law that had never been used before that made it a federal crime to cross state lines to incite a riot. And he charged the leaders of the protests. These were protests against the Democrats. The Democrats didn't charge the people who protested them. The Republicans charged them. And it was a sort of all kinds of different people. Originally, there were 8, including one black man, Bobby Seale, one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party. He'd had nothing to do with this. They were also charged with conspiracy. And Jody, maybe we should talk about conspiracy as a kind of a useful tool that prosecutors have been using since the 60s. The thing we most remember from that trial, the one thing that we have to remember, is Bobby Seale did not have a lawyer. His lawyer was in the hospital in San Francisco, and he demanded his right to have a lawyer or else to represent himself. It's his right under the Constitution. The courtroom, the judge, Julius Hoffman, said, there's other lawyers in this courtroom. You can have one of them. He said, these are not my lawyers. I want my own lawyer. So maybe we should also talk about the right to counsel, it's called. It's kind of an important thing in America. He kept insisting. The judge ordered him bound and gagged and chained in the courtroom. And this was a horrifying scene that we hadn't seen before and really haven't seen since. A black man chained and gagged in an American courtroom for demanding his constitutional rights. That's the one thing we remember from this trial. Now, compared to today, the interesting thing is Donald Trump never indicted the leaders of Black Lives Matter for conspiracy to incite. It's I hate to say it, but Nixon was worse than Trump in this regard. And although they were found not guilty of incitement, they were convicted of conspiracy. So conspiracy will work even when the other crimes can't be proven. So the first questions the trial raises are about conspiracy charges, the federal government charging leaders of a mass movement, and the role of the police in effectively suppressing demonstrations and intimidating people from showing up. Jody, I know you've thought about this.
Yes, I think that's just such a great, way of setting the table, John, and shining a light on what my concern is in a lot of these cases, because I remember in the events that happened around the White House when the protesters, many call them insurrectionists, took over, government buildings and did a lot of damage, caused a lot of damage. A lot of people were saying, one thing, we need domestic terrorism laws to address them. And we need to go after people, and what they were doing were terrorist acts, number two. And we need to go after people like Trump for incitement, number three, right? And all of those, I'm listening and saying, okay, but you're really opening up a troublesome precedent if you start going down that road. Yeah, I understand that they were engaged in some very aggressive behavior that turned violent, and on a number of occasions, right? But I saw out here this past summer a lot of protests that became aggressive and violent. And we weren't calling them terrorists because we should not have called them terrorists. That's why, because we should not have, right? But we can't start too easily then applying that label to others and not expecting it to be turned on us if we establish that kind of precedent. So I worry about it in that way. I worry about it when it comes to what constitutes incitement. I'm getting ready to teach this in criminal law now. It's wide open. It's whatever the jury says it is. It's whatever the prosecution and jury says it is. And sadly, is what it starts to come down to a lot of ways. A lot of times, lots of flexibility, lots of discretion baked into the legal standard for incitement could easily be applied to somebody like Armour saying, hey, go out there and fight the power. Hey, what's he talking about fight? That's a violent act. He's inciting violence, fighting the power. So it's at moments like this that I think it's sometimes hard for those of us who are progressives, who are fighting for real social change, when we see people who are doing, obviously morally obtuse things or retrograde things. We kind of have a punitive, retributive impulse, a retributive urge, let's crack down on them in some way, take them off of social media, come up with domestic violence laws, come up with, new ways to go after them for incitement, not thinking about what a double-edged rager that is and how it's going to be used on socially marginalized groups more, dissenters and dissidents from, the powerless rather than the powerful.
And there was one there going back to Chicago in '68, there was a conspiracy, but it wasn't the conspiracy of the organizers of the demonstration. The real conspiracy was between the Chicago police and the FBI to assassinate the leaders of the Black Panther Party, which they succeeded in doing. Fred Hampton, the 21-year-old, just a kid, 21-year-old, very brilliant, talented, charismatic, smart, good organizer, head of the Illinois Black Panther Party, murdered in his sleep by the Chicago police after an informer gave them a floor plan of the Panthers' apartment. This is all the story's told in this new movie, Judas and the Black Messiah, which is on HBO Max, starring Daniel Kaluuya. That's an important part of the history of Chicago in 68 too. That was in December 1968 during the trial of the Chicago 7. It's there's this other, maybe you've heard, Aaron Sorkin has a movie called Trial of the Chicago 7, which includes the scene of Bobby Seale bound and gagged in the courtroom. And they refer very briefly to, there's one scene where they talk about the murder of Fred Hampton. This is one of the this was one of the most promising, talented, brilliant leaders of the Black Panthers. And the FBI wanted to kill him. The Chicago police did kill him. And eventually they were, it took, I think, 25 years for the city of Chicago to make amends, pay a settlement to the surviving family members. The FBI eventually apologized. That took a long time. Jody and I have had there was a scary event where one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles, Melina Abdullah, the police surrounded her house this summer. Very scary incident. And we were, is this going to happen again in Los Angeles? All her neighbors came out and filled the streets. Social media put the word up. I don't know, Jody, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, John, what you just laid out is the case for, because what you just said sounds like a conspiracy theory, quack theory. It does. You hear COINTELPRO, the FBI through COINTELPRO was actually engaged in subverting, progressive leadership within these communities to serve some kind of, maybe political agenda, some other kind of agenda. It just sounds far-fetched to a lot of people. And that's, I think, what the importance of good, solid, evidence-based scholarship, that's why it's so important, like the stuff you're doing, when you come with the receipts, when you're saying, Colin Kaepernick is going down on one knee because, there's a lot of hypocrisy between what we're saying in a lot of those, anthems and ceremonies and what we're doing. And people say, well, what do you mean there's hypocrisy? America is just the land of milk and honey, always has been. And certainly couldn't be, intolerably unjust enough to justify somebody like Kaepernick going down on one knee about some grievances. But when you really lay out the case like you do of how COINTELPRO targeted Black leadership, undermined the civil rights movement, and our own government is capable of doing that to its citizens, its Black citizens, you can understand why the Black community is so skeptical oftentimes, not just of law enforcement, but even of government in general. And that's hitting us with COVID-19 when it comes to Blacks being skeptical of healthcare workers after the Tuskegee experiments, right? In which they let syphilis just run rampant on untreated Black patients so they could just study the disease, right? And did that over the course of many years. And so that has generated the same kind of skepticism in the Black community towards a lot of state, a lot of state institutions. At the same time, the Black community really needs the support of those state institutions, but it's also, has this well-grounded skepticism, that comes from these real world events like you're talking about. COINTELPRO for real. The Iran-Contra connection was for real. The CIA was in there with the Contras in the, going after the Nicaraguans, helping to pump cocaine into South Central, through the, because the Boland amendments tied the hands of the Reagan administration, they were going to get the communists out of here anyway. So that's real. It's not just, it sounds like, it sounds so, jaw-dropping that it can't be real until people like you, John, start breaking out the receipts.
This is a bookstore event, and I just want to mention Jody's book. It's one of my favorite books of the year, N-Word Theory. That's N asterisk GGA is the way he spells it. He calls it the unspeakable and unparaphrasable word that is troublesome and transgressive. Jody, I think you got to explain, why did you put this word in the title of your book, a word that nobody is allowed to speak?
It's for that very reason, to encourage critical self-reflection on the nature of language itself and how some words can both push away and divide and denigrate, as well as pull toward and embrace and stand in solidarity with. And the N word does both of those things. It is perhaps the vilest epithet in the English language because it's so rooted in slavery as well as post-slavery. And a lot of people feel that any word that has roots in such a racist past cannot be used in any other way than a racist way in the current day. That, you know, fruit of the poisonous tree kind of logic. If the roots are running in a poisonous path, then current day fruit of that tree, applications of that word can't help but be tainted fruit of that poisonous tree. I argue against that way of looking at language in the book. I say that's not how language works, and it robs language of its midwifery properties, its properties to bring about really transformational social change. So when somebody like, you know, Tupac, for example, says, how many brothers fell victim to the street? Rest in peace, young niggas, there's a heaven for a G. I'd be a lie if I told you that I never thought of death. My niggas, we the last ones left. He's using the N word in a very different way than, you know, a racist and with a hood over his head on a horseback with a rope, right? And a lot of Black artists, from Tupac to Nas to Cube to Kendrick Lamar, have embraced the word and made it part of their creative expression, right? Along with people like Dave Chappelle and Richard Pryor and those folks. So, you know, for all those reasons, John, and one final one is, so those are the kind of reasons that have to do with communication language. I like to go into that. But I also like to think about the people we most otherize, the people we most demonize, the people we most monsterize. In other words, I call it in the book niggerize in the criminal justice system, and that is violent criminals. And unless we can radically alter how we think about violent criminals, revolutionize our consciousness when it comes to blame and punishment of violent criminals. Unless we can do that, we can never make deep cuts in mass incarceration, because contrary to what Michelle Alexander says in the New Jim Crow, most people in prison aren't there for low-level nonviolent drug offenses. Most of them are there for violent offenses. So if you want to make deep cuts and racialize mass incarceration, it's going to require us to overhaul the moral framework we look through at, you know, criminal justice issues through, move away from retribution, retaliation, and revenge toward restoration, redemption, and rehabilitation. And so that is kind of I got into the N word for all those reasons.
This is the radical core of Jody's book and of Jody's work, and really of Jody's life, that you gotta remember, the people who are in prison are mostly not innocent. They're mostly not low-level drug possession offenses. They are violent criminals, and we've got to change the way we think about retribution and how we bring them back into our world. Jody, you open your book with a political battle cry. You say, call me the N-word. You say this, and you point out, a critic of yours said, Jody, you went to Harvard. You know, you're a tenured professor with a named chair at an elite law school. You, sir, he said, you, sir, are not an N-word. What's your reply to that?
And the reason I got into that early in the book, John, is to make it clear that you cannot reduce race to class. You have to talk about race and class simultaneously, but sometimes people want to reduce race to class and say, oh, all the issues of racism could be addressed if we just dealt with the class issues. And one of the things that I'm trying to point out with that is, and Stevie Wonder's, one of his most trenchant lyrics is, you might make big cash, but you cannot cash in your face. And the face of crime for millions of Americans is Black. And as long as, and that we see in study after study, and, you know, and the laboratory data we gather as well. And so what that means is that even Black Brahmin, if you will, like those who live around me in View Park here in LA, called Black Beverly Hills by the Los Angeles Times, I've heard these, you know, Black Brahmins say things like, you know, I am enraged because even though I have all these degrees after my name, all these accomplishments, I'm a high income tax bracket, I am still profiled. I still can't drive down the street without being, you know, a suspicious person, and that enrages me. So, you know, you can't just earn your way out of the caste, if you will, the status of Blackness in America. It's just not, it doesn't happen like that. Moreover, you can really see how it's not just about class, but about race. When you think of books like Murray and Herrnstein's Bell Curve, that said Blacks are genetically, intellectually inferior, genetically. That's any of you, all right, that's you as a group, Black folk, right? You may high achievers, low achievers. We're going to say this about all of you. And that was a best-selling book, John. You remember that was a bestseller. Murray was making the rounds with that.
Yes, yes. Our topic here is Chicago, in the 60s, in light of today's protest movements. I just want to emphasize how important what happened this past summer was, not just this year, but in all of American history. I mean, in the 60s, the high point of American protests in the 20th century, we had like 250,000 people march in Washington, 500,000 people at the biggest mobilization against the war in Vietnam. What we had this past summer was millions of people in hundreds of cities, and not just for one day, sustained over weeks and months. A multi-ethnic, diverse group of people all over America. And what impressed me the most about this is not just the size, not just the diversity, not just the continuing pressure that was put on the powers that be, but the way Black Lives Matter combined militant street protest with really smart electoral politics. We saw that in LA, where we succeeded in electing a progressive DA. This is Los Angeles County, the largest county in the United States, 10 million people, the largest jail system in the United States. That happened because of smart electoral politics by the same people who'd been leading those street protests. Jody, you were one of them. You know what I'm talking about.
It was really inspiring, John. We've chatted about it in the past a little bit, that it showed the power of the people. It really was people power in the streets. You saw the streets of LA and the nation roiling with people saying that we have reached our limit. We've gone beyond our limit of intolerable injustice, and something's got to be done about it. And what you then saw, as you pointed out, in November was those protests translate into concrete changes at the ballot box. You had, Chesa, I was going to say Chesa Boudin, he's up in the San Francisco, progressive prosecutor up here. No, down here, Jackie Lacey was a traditional law and order prosecutor who wrapped herself in her social identity. In her campaign literature, she said, I'm the first Black woman to be, in this position, a DA, and I'm the first woman to be in this position, a DA. And so, that should really count heavily in my favor. And the problem with that argument that she was trying to make, though, was on the other side with the Black Lives Matter activists, those were Black women. Those were Black women saying, no, we're looking at the substance of the policies. We're looking beyond, kind of the politics of pigmentation here right now, and focusing on what are the nuts and bolts of what you're proposing. And also Measure J, which was essentially a defund the police measure, taking 10% of the county's annual budget, which is up to $1 billion a year. County budget's up to $10 billion a year. So up to $1 billion a year to incarceration alternatives. The voters voted that in, and that was a direct result, as you point out, of this generational upheaval that we saw in the streets over the summer. And I'm just glad that I lived to see it. I didn't see it as even a possibility 10 years ago, but it's the product of tireless infrastructure building by the Black Lives Matter movement. 2014, 15, 16. They were building. When the cameras went away, they kept building, kept networking, kept strengthening the sinews of connection so that, for example, they were getting out in front of Jackie Lacey's office every Wednesday for over 3 years, protesting until the George Floyd moment came along. And then when George Floyd moment came along, it was able to ride that infrastructure, ride all of that work that had been there, plug right in. And then, like you said, John, it's something we've never seen.
And so now in LA, we have a progressive DA. He wants to get rid of cash bail. He wants to get rid of the death penalty. He wants to get rid of imprisoning people for low-level nonviolent offenses. He wants to, it's a long list of things. And as a result of that, it isn't over yet. It's just the battle is, we're just getting started here, because now the police unions, the prosecutors unions, the prison guards unions, they are all going to spend millions of dollars to get rid of the progressive DA here in LA, in Philadelphia, in San Francisco. So we got the beginning, Jody, but it ain't over yet.
It's going to be a long slog, because even if you're a progressive DA and you go before a judge, recognize that judge you're going before, if they most likely are former prosecutors. If you're talking about somebody who is either a former prosecutor or a public defender, they're much more likely to have been a former prosecutor than any kind of public defender. So you're standing in front of a former prosecutor a lot of times, and you're telling that former prosecutor that the professional and personal identity that you embraced for most of your career, the 20, 30, or 40 years you were a prosecutor, was misguided and caused more harm a lot of times than good. That you actually were engaging in practices that were morally obtuse, sending 18-year-olds, for example, away like Jackie Lacey did, 25 to life for taking a cell phone from the unoccupied car's back seat, with 2 prior 16-year-old purse snatchings, 25 to life. That's just morally obtuse. I'm sorry. But many of you on the bench embraced that approach to blame and punishment. It was all about retribution, retaliation, and revenge for you. And so now you take it very personally that people are saying that was misguided. You caused a lot of harm. And so there's a lot of resistance. They're running the progressive DAs are running into from former judges, even sometimes former lawmakers. And what they have on their side every time when they run up against these old guards is one thing: the will of the people. They voted me in on a progressive prosecutor platform, restoration, rehabilitation, redemption, and that's what we're going to do.
Thanks, Jody, for bringing up the judges, right, and that role in the justice system. Jon, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the judge in the trial. And I watched the movie with my 14-year-old as part of homeschool for us. She was glued. She loved it. And her question was, is he racist or is he crazy? And I wonder if you could maybe, or both, share some insight into what you
So
think.
we're talking here about the Aaron Sorkin film, The Trial of Chicago 7. The judge, Julius Hoffman, was extreme even for federal judges, I gotta say. I mean, there were a lot of conservative, racist judges. I mean, this guy was not in Mississippi. He was not in Alabama. He was in Chicago, a Democratic town. When the defendants yelled at him that he was a racist, he was shocked. He said, "How can you say I'm a racist? I ordered school desegregation, in the late 50s of Chicago. They love me in Black Chicago." It had never occurred to him. He referred to the underprivileged. The underprivileged love me in Chicago, he said. So he was old. I mean, he was already almost 70, I think. So he was an extreme case of a racist judge. And he also was very preoccupied with his own standing. I mean, he sentenced all the defendants. They kind of left this out at the end of the movie, to months and in some case years of prison time for contempt of court. And really almost all the contempt of court was around shouting at the judge when Bobby Seale was bound, gagged, and chained in the courtroom, that this was unbearable to see. And all those contempt citations were reversed. It turns out, this is a footnote, you know, the trial lasted 5.5 months. The movie lasts about 2 hours. So he's got to kind of eliminate things and leave things out. But the other thing about Aaron Sorkin is he likes to have a happy ending. And the movie does have a happy ending. That's probably why it's getting all these nominations for Academy Awards and Golden Globes and the Actors Guild and the Directors Guild. The happy ending is that Tom Hayden gets up and reads the list of names of people who have died, Americans who have died in Vietnam, which the judge has forbidden him from doing. And by defying the judge, the courtroom erupts in applause, and that's the happy ending. In real life, that trial did not have a happy ending. In real life, 5 of the 7 defendants were found guilty of conspiracy to incite a riot and sentenced to 5 years in prison. And all the defendants were found guilty of contempt of court. Some were sentenced to 4 months or 6 months, and some were sentenced to years, including the lead defense attorney was sentenced to years in prison for contempt of court. So Aaron Sorkin likes happy endings. I mean, it was a happy ending. I myself leapt to my feet in my living room and cheered for Tom Hayden. Yes, speak truth to power. But you know, it wasn't a happy ending, and it took another couple of years of appeals and you know, more work by lawyers, people like Jody, to put it to rest. But yeah, it's a very engaging, entertaining film, and it leaves out a lot. But I'm glad. How old is your daughter?
She's 14.
And she liked the movie. She learned a lot from it, and she enjoyed it.
Yeah, we had to stop it quite a bit just to, you know, process and explain some things. And now she's reading the real story, so she can point out and understand the differences between Hollywood and what actually happened. But yeah.
Well, you know, the defendant, most of the defendants have died. The ones who are still alive, although they and their families all said there's this film has horrible, terrible, outrageous inaccuracies, but a lot of them said people should watch this movie anyway, because the movie does say speaking truth to power is a good thing. It does say protest is a good thing. It does say the justice system is unjust. The prosecutors are the bad guys in this. The judge and the prosecutors are the bad guys. I mean, if anybody was treated unjustly, it was the prosecutors. They are shown to have second thoughts. The lead prosecutor is shown, he's got a tortured conscience about what he's doing, that these people really aren't guilty of conspiracy. In fact, the real life prosecutor is still around. He was outraged. He said, I never had any doubts about this prosecution. I still think they were all guilty. I've been treated unfairly in this movie too. It isn't just Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. So the movie, I mean, I think they're right. The movie does show protest is a good thing. It's an American thing. The prosecutors and the judges can be oppressive enemies of justice. And whatever the other historical inaccuracies, however unhappy the true ending was, the movie does make a good point, and I sort of hope it wins some awards. Jody, what did you think of the movie?
Well, you know, look, there's no question that we have. I was talking last week, John, to Ice-T, who has been on Law and Order SVU for over 20 years now.
I was going to say, he's getting old. He's getting old.
Yeah, you know, I don't think there's another actor who's been doing a show longer than he on TV right now. But before he was doing playing the detective on Law and Order SVU, I was talking to him about the fact that he was talking about in Cop Killer, one of his songs that generated a lot of controversy and had people saying that he needed to be prosecuted. Speaking of, you know, speech again, he was saying, hey, you know, if somebody, if a cop shoots up, you know, a kid, kills a innocent kid, then why not? Why shouldn't he get shot back, right? So he have that kind of, he's coming from that perspective back there, you know, in that kind of gangster rap persona, and a very different one with Law and Order. And I got into a little more about how over the summer, people started putting Law and Order shows under a microscope and saying, why is it that we've had this steady diet of Law and Order stories, Law and Order perspective, from Dragnet through Adam 12, Hill Street Blues. You turn on, in the middle of the summer, I could turn on the TV, and literally in the middle of June, there were like, I had 21, I counted one night, 21 different cop shows, CSI, various CSI shows, Monk, all kinds of shows, you know, that from the cop's perspective, you know, and when you're constantly getting that narrative perspective, you know, that has a lot of impact on how you think about things, right? And so for a movie to come from another perspective than law enforcement, than one that is, you know, glorifying law enforcement or showing how law enforcement has a redemptive arc. He starts out bad, but then he becomes better or whatever, you know, they have all those kind of stories, right? But they're all from that narrative perspective. And this gives you a different narrative perspective. And that alternative narrative perspective can be profoundly important politically. It's a profoundly important part of political communication.
Do we have some questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, Jon, I have one for you from audience member Janine Woodworth. She's interested to know what inspired you to write your book, Conspiracy in the Streets. I mean, we've been given examples of plenty of opportunities to highlight nefarious acts on the part of the government. What was it about this trial for you?
I'll just hold up the cover. You know, I teach about the 60s. I write about the 60s. I've got another book about LA in the 60s called Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s. It's a movement in history. So thank you, Jody.
Great.
And this is sort of one chapter. The Chicago story is one chapter of the 60s. It's a kind of a hard one to tell. What the book is actually a greatly condensed trial transcript is what most of it is. The real trial transcript is 22,000 pages. Now, that's a hard thing for anybody to read. And there's like a 900-page condensation of it. And my publisher said, why don't we put out something people might actually read and make it more readable, and put in a historical introduction explaining what this was actually about and who was who and why it came down the way it did. Tom Hayden, one of the defendants, was alive when we did this, and I worked with him on it. He wrote an afterword, a more personal thing about what it was like to be on trial, and what the legacy was for him personally, what lessons he took from that into other protests movements he'd been part of. So it's a package that contains a 40-page sort of explanation of what this was, who the people were, why it happened, why it ended the way it did. Then it's got the highlights. I mean, it was an amazing trial. It was the wildest trial in American history, really, in terms of what happened in the courtroom. Very little of the wild stuff is shown in the movie. I mean, they had poets, they had the defense put on the entire counterculture to show that this wasn't just a couple of people conspiring. This was a whole culture of young people. And they were allowed to have poets and folk singers and novelists and journalists on the stand. And then there's the condensation of the trial with these great courtroom illustrations by Jules Feiffer, very famous cartoonist. And then there's Tom Hayden's memoir at the end. So it's kind of a package that our goal is to make it more accessible. And this book came out long before Aaron Sorkin's movie came out. I mean, Aaron Sorkin was working on his movie for 10 years. But once it became an Academy Award contender, you know, we put a little star on the cover here that says now a major motion picture, just to remind people, this is a book. It's about the same thing that Aaron Sorkin's movie is about. So that's how this came to be.
Thank you for that. We have another question from audience member Colin Perriman, which is timely. It's part of a conversation that's happening within our community, and I think you could both weigh in on it. What is the next step for school policing in terms of due process and Miranda rights, defunding the police? Will school police ever go back to pastoral instead of current punitive roles? It's a great question.
Yeah, that's been one of the big demands of the folks in the streets over the summer was we need to defund, i.e. unbundle the police. And as you pointed out, I belong to an organization, LEAP, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, of current and former chiefs of police down through captains, lieutenants, right down to the rank and file, who've been saying for years that you're saddling us with too many responsibilities and duties that aren't in our purview, that aren't in our wheelhouse. Right? We're not and shouldn't be street level social workers, right? You should, and too often that's what we've done. Our approach to poverty governance is to just throw police at those problems. You know, we withdrew our support for social programs. You know, with Reagan, you know, putting a black face on welfare queens driving up in their Cadillacs to get checks. And in other ways, we've demonized people who've been in any way recipients of any kind of public welfare or social support. And in place of social support, and you saw this with the Clinton budget. Clinton ended welfare as we knew it, you know, ended that FDR program that would take a Democrat to end, just like it, you know, Nixon it took to go to China. It took a Democrat to come in and take the scissors to that FDR program. And then what did he do? Turn around? Okay, at the same time, roughly, the 94 crime bill. You know, so I'm more police, more prisons. At the same time, I'm taking away social support. I'm increasing criminogenic conditions, the foreseeable consequences of which are going to be more, you know, kinds of street level crimes. And then I'm just going to, you know, make our jails the receptacles of our social failures. You know, that's going to be our social policy approach. And so that is, that's something that, you know, that we made some decisions about and followed through on, John. And now, you know, we're at a crossroads in terms of where we're going to go next.
And you're here in LA. We keep coming back to LA partly because both of us live here, but partly because LA is a really big city with a really big public school district, LAUSD. I think it's the biggest or the second biggest public school system in the United States. And we have a good school board right now that is cutting the budget of the school police. And they want to move that money into counselors, into smaller classrooms so that teachers can have fewer kids who they can then have more personal relationships with. We don't want truancy to be a crime, that to send the cops to arrest them and bring them into juvenile court. And we're making progress on that front here in LA, just in the last month, if I'm not mistaken, Jody.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's the prison, the school to prison pipeline. We're finally doing something about it.
Thank you for that. I just want to be mindful of our time. I'm not sure, one of our authors might have to leave right before 8 o'clock, and it is 1 minute of 8 by my watch. So
unfortunately, I have to, because I love this. I have to talk to, I'm going to be talking to some USC athletes.
Wow.
Right. Some students, and we're going to talk about, you know, politics and being an athlete at a, you know, an institution, you know, that's kind of high profile like USC. How can you bring your Black Lives Matter self to the gridiron, to the hardwood? You know, can you bring your protest self? You know, Bill Walton back in the day used to bring his protest self to the hardwood, right? Got him in a little hot water, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, you know. So it'll be interesting to talk to these youngins about, you know, the stuff that we're talking about, John. So I'm going to take this history that I've been learning from you now and spread it to some of our SC athletes.
Fantastic. You know, we've really enjoyed this hour. It's such a treat for us to be with you in Concord, New Hampshire. And we want to thank SURJ, and we want to thank the Gibson's Bookstore. We want to thank our hosts, and we want to thank everybody in the audience. We like doing this.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be with you all this evening. Thank you to all of our guests. And Ryan, would you like to close us out for the evening?
Absolutely. Just a reminder that all of the books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. I just popped those links in the chat again. Jon, Jody, Sarah, Carissa, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you everyone for joining us from home. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you all.